What will happen to the trillion-dollar copper scroll treasures? The copper scroll is the most unusual of all the Dead Sea Scrolls, a treasure map of what might be Solomon's temple treasures, like the Ark of the Covenant and the incense altar, showing the exact locations and where to dig. It was engraved on copper and appears to have survived over 2,600 years. Extra biblical texts say it was engraved by Haggai and Zechariah, the prophets, and that the treasures were hidden by Jeremiah himself. And these documents also say it is being hidden to be used by the Messiah Jesus himself. How cool is that? So where are these hidden treasures of priceless value located? This is part 2 of our videos on the Copper Scroll, and in this episode, we're going to look at where they are and what they are. What was listed on this scroll? What are these treasures worth trillions and trillions of US dollars? And at the end, we're going to look at who the Bible says might come into control of these treasures of gold and silver. So hang tight for another thrilling episode. In our first episode on the Copper Scroll, we learned that ancient Hebrew documents from the Apocrypha and stone tablets from the tomb of Ezekiel the prophet indicate that when the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar invaded Jerusalem, the prophet Jeremiah assigned 100 priests to hide the temple treasures worth not billions, but probably trillions of dollars in today's money. The value of the treasures of the Copper Scroll, though, cannot be measured in currency. It must be measured by historic and religious importance, and that is simply immeasurable to Christians and Jews. Then, according to these documents, 5 separate men, including Haggai and Zechariah the prophets, drew up a treasure map saying where all the temple treasures and artifacts were located, and they engraved this map on a sheet of 1/8-inch copper sheeting to keep it from decaying over time. The scroll was discovered in 1952, only 4 years after the Reformation of the nation of Israel, in a secret chamber behind a false wall in one of the caves containing other Dead Sea Scrolls. So what is listed on the scroll? The scroll is very matter-of-fact. It is not a literary document with stories and characters. It has 64 locations, 63 of which are treasures of gold and silver, which have been estimated in the tons, actually over 170 tons of precious metal. And one location indicates there is a second treasure map, a second scroll, with additional information on what is hidden. Yes, imagine that. Also included in the buried treasures is a new book by Haggai the prophet, never seen before. What in the world might that book reveal? One entry also apparently mentions priestly vestments, including the ephod or breastplate of the high priest with 12 precious stones set in it, one for each of the tribes of Israel. The following English translation of the opening lines of the first column of the Copper Scroll shows the basic structure of each of the entries in the scroll. The structure is the general location, then the specific location, often with a distance to dig, and 3, what to find. Here it is. In the ruins, which are in the valley of Achor, under the steps leading to the east 70 cubits, a money chest and its contents, of a weight of 17 talents. Other equally cryptic inscriptions about the other 60-some-odd locations left scholars puzzled for 60 years after the discovery of the scroll. And as if to add to the confusion, set among the Hebrew characters are random Greek letters. Yes, randomly placed Greek letters which seem to have no relation to the Hebrew and no relationship to the treasure. Another mystery on top of the other mysteries. which brings us to the probable solution of a treasure map. Scholars were completely baffled by the directions on the scroll, which appeared they could have been anywhere within Israel. Where was the treasure? Most scholars spent little or no time thinking about it because it was so complex. Then in 2006, a Christian from Oklahoma, an arson investigator with an interest in biblical things, decided to look at the scroll. Unlike the scholars, he decided to do something totally unique. He decided to assume the scroll was literal and said exactly what it meant. The man is named James Barfield, and when he read the Valley of Achor that we looked at earlier in the first entry, he knew that this was the Dead Sea Valley, and the only ruins in that area were the ruins in Qumran. Barfield's unique thought was that all the treasure was buried under the ruins of Qumran. Barfield decided to test the first location, under the steps entering to the east 40 cubits. He got out his map of Qumran and found the only steps heading in an eastern direction and measured them. According to the map scale, the distance, exactly 40 cubits. Excited, Barfield continued to situate the treasure locations given on the scroll with locations in Qumran. The second location was listed as being in a damaged dry cistern at the north end of the ruins. Barfield's map showed a cistern at the north end of town, likely damaged by the Babylonians. Then a third location matched perfectly, but it was the fourth that really made the jaws of even the archaeologists whom Barfield later showed his evidence to. It made their jaws drop. The location was a 6 cubit by 6 cubit ritual bath at the north end of town with 2 entrances, one going down and to the left. And guess what? There is a bath just like that in Qumran that exactly matches those dimensions and descriptions. In fact, one by one, all the locations matched, and the final 4 locations proposed by Barfield form a perfectly straight line, ascending a hill behind the Qumran ruins, pointing like an arrow to a hidden cave. A cave that may contain the most historically important items from the Holy of Holies. Yes, he believes this final site might contain the Ark of the Covenant, the tabernacle, the incense altar, and all the items hidden by Jeremiah, and likely also the second scroll. Of course, if the Ark is there, it contradicts Ron Wyatt's supposed discovery of the Ark in the city of Jerusalem in Zedekiah's cave. Well, which site do I endorse? The answer? Neither. Until an ark is removed from the ground, we simply don't know. Now, which do I suspect is correct, considering that the Qumran location is supported by non-biblical sources like 2 Maccabees that we discussed in our previous video? I personally favor Qumran. However, the true site remains to be seen. It could even be in Ethiopia, as legend has it. So after Barfield's research, using a map of the site and seeing all these incredible matches between the scroll and the map, he went to Israel to view the site personally. This began a highly frustrating 10-year process of Barfield attempting to get the Israeli authorities to approve an archaeological exploration of the Qumran site. This effort is detailed in the book The Copper Scroll Project by author Shelley Neese, which I happen to have in my private library and which I've read and recommend. A link to purchase the book will appear in the description below. During that period, there was one minor archaeological dig done to the depth of a couple feet. However, because the copper scroll indicates that the depth of most of the items is more like 12 feet deep, this was a pretty pointless exercise. The archaeological teams missed the items by 10 feet. This brings up several important points. It is unlikely that the treasure hunters or grave robbers throughout history found the temple treasures during antiquity. Because of this depth, and the fact that the ruins in Qumran just didn't seem a likely place to go searching for treasure. So from that perspective, it is likely the items are still there. Second, the depth the items are buried at also indicates why archaeologists haven't found them. Archaeologists dig only to the level where human habitation existed. After that, they stop. This is only a few feet, but the prophet Jeremiah's wisdom placed the treasures far, far deeper. So, after the frustration of the initial archaeological dig, Barfield obtained a very sophisticated metal detector, able to determine the difference between precious metal like gold and normal iron or ferrous metals, and all to the depth of 50 feet. His hope was to scan the site to see if his theory was true. Unfortunately, his request to scan the site, which is a non-intrusive study and should have been able to be done, was denied. Now here's where the story gets very interesting. In 2013, Barfield was in New York, where he was introduced to Moshe Feiglin, who at the time was a Likud member of the Knesset, Israel's parliament. Feiglin was a strong advocate for rebuilding the temple and became excited when he heard Barfield's story. Now, Israeli parliament members are given legal immunity. So as a member of the Knesset, Feiglin could not be charged with a crime if he scanned the site for Barfield. So one day, Barfield and Feiglin wandered around the tourist site carrying a large duffel bag, as if they were tourists. They visited 5 spots that Barfield felt were the most likely spots to find treasure. Of course, the duffel bag contained the metal detector, which lit up like it was scanning a gold mine. Despite the positive finding, the Israeli government and Antiquities Association are still not permitting Barfield to investigate, and there has been a moratorium on archaeological digging at Qumran. 12 feet of earth is likely all that is separating the world from what we might find, the treasures of Solomon's temple. But unfortunately, atheism and politics stand in the way. You see, 99% of the Israeli population are non-believing. There is a large element of the elite in Israel who don't want proof that the Bible is accurate. And politically, Qumran is in Area C, and different laws apply to the archaeology there than in other parts of Israel. Area C means it is territory disputed by both Israel and Jordan. Anything discovered can also be disputed. The Israeli government is likely concerned that if earth-shaking treasure is brought to light, Jordan or the Palestinian Authority will sue for it, even if it originated in a Jewish temple. It is also possible they fear that the uncovering of the temple items might spark a revival throughout Israel to rebuild the temple and create unprecedented international unrest and maybe even war. So for 7 years, the Israelis have had the proof of treasure and have done nothing. Risk of doing nothing, of course, is that if the land of Israel is divided and the West Bank given to the Palestinians, this treasure would fall into Palestinian possession. At the end of the video, we will give you our ideas on what we imagine the future might hold. And yes, you're going to be shocked. Some of these involve Bible passages. In the meantime, Barfield's wonderful research hasn't resulted in nothing at all. In addition to the amazing value of the archaeological items, Barfield's investigation has shown some other fascinating things about the Qumran site and the Copper Scroll. First is an idea of what those cryptic Greek letters might mean on the scroll. Now, if you remember from our last video, scattered about the scroll are a number of disconnected Greek letters. 7 of the location names are followed by a group of 2 or 3 Greek letters. Now, academic scholars have connected this with Greek inventory methods, using similar cataloging methods at the Greek Temple of Apollo. This might make sense to scholars who view the ancient world as secularists, but to a religious Jew, would this cataloging system of Greek make sense? It is very unlikely. But why would Jeremiah and his compatriots include Greek letters, especially letters that do not form words? It is Barfield's contention that they are part of an encrypted prophetic message to the last days church, and that the second scroll, which is still hidden at the site, contains the second half of the message. Wow! Wouldn't that be cool? But who knows? Here are these letters that we do have, just in case a brilliant member of our community solves what they mean without the second scroll. But that isn't me, folks. Sorry. Also of incredible interest is the architectural plan of Qumran. Barfield noticed that the city plan of Qumran was a miniature version of Jerusalem at the time of Jeremiah, with many of the buildings carrying the same name as the buildings in Jerusalem. Now, why would Israelites build a miniature Jerusalem in the desert? Barfield has ideas about that too. He believes it may have been the home of the prophets. In fact, Barfield believes that priests who lived there and worshiped there were not necessarily Levites, but maybe of the order of Melchizedek, or as I prefer to pronounce it, Melchizedek, the king of righteousness. Now that's entirely speculation, however. Also of interest in Qumran was a large fortified building with sloping sides, which Barfield believes was the treasury building storing treasures for the temple in Jerusalem. In Barfield's opinion, it is the long sought-after treasury of Hakaz, known for centuries to possibly have been in the area of Qumran. The description on the scroll matches the massive building with sloping walls perfectly. And the name Hakaz is found on the copper scroll. Item 32 in the cave that is next to an unreadable word, belonging to the house of Hakaz, dig 6 cubits. There are 6 bars of gold. Hakaz was a priestly family who traced their lineage back to the time of King David. Later, they were disqualified from priestly duties because of a problem with their genealogy. The family then was likely assigned another important role. Some biblical references suggest they became treasurers for the temple. If so, then, the fact that some of the copper scroll treasure was buried on Hakaz land provides a link between it and the temple. Then, of course, there is the second scroll. Item 64, in a cave adjoining on the north, in a hole opening northward and buried at its mouth, a copy of this document with an explanation and their measurements and an inventory of each and every thing. This entry tells us there is another copy of the copper scroll with more complete information. Some have suggested that neither the original copper scroll nor the one mentioned in entry 64 are sufficient by themselves to locate all the treasure, and that only someone with both can hope to recover the lost riches. And as we mentioned, Barfield is of the opinion that the encrypted Greek message for the end-time church requires both scrolls to read it. This would make finding that second scroll of prime importance. So what do we think is going to happen? Well, I have a couple theories. First, based on Israel's inactivity in the last 7 years, it just doesn't seem they will dig until a political solution is developed. Now, once one is negotiated, maybe they will dig and use the vessels of the temple. Maybe. However, once the Antichrist is in charge of this region, it seems almost impossible that he won't dig in this area if Israel already hasn't. What will he do with the gold and gems found? Well, Daniel the prophet may tell us. But instead, he will honor a God of fortresses, a God whom his father did not know. He will honor him with gold, silver, costly stones, and treasures. Might this be the copper scroll treasures, gold and gems? And just a few verses later, he will gain control over the hidden treasures of gold and silver, and over all the precious things of Egypt. Well, what hidden gold might Daniel be prophesying about? I believe it might be the copper scroll gold. In fact, isn't it most likely that that's what he's talking about? Otherwise, what hidden gold does he mean? Will the Antichrist then bring the treasures of Solomon's temple into the newly built temple and honor this God of fortresses initially and then eventually himself? That is my theory. In this previous episode about the temple, who rebuilds the temple, we discussed how it was likely that the Antichrist will be the one who works with Israel to build the temple. So might they at that time dig up the temple treasures, and then when the Antichrist turns on Israel, might these hidden treasures of gold and silver come under his control? However, eventually, as we saw in the previous initial video on the Copper Scroll, we know from Amos 9 that Jesus will raise the fallen tabernacle of David. So in my opinion, Jesus eventually controls all these treasures. In our next video, we're going to continue to look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we're going to learn what the writers of the Dead Sea Scrolls thought about end times back 100 years before Jesus. What you'll learn is that their opinion differs from 99% of scholars today. But interestingly, it seems to match up with many of the thoughts we've presented on this channel. In a 2,100-year-old Bible study, the writer of that Dead Sea Scroll will walk you through scriptures all over the Old Testament that describe the timing and events of the end times. You'll want to keep watching, so click right here. Now, if the video has not been published yet, subscribe and click the bell notification when you do, so that you can be notified when this exciting new episode comes out.